Welcome to The Brown Box, a podcast that explores the stories of brown women in Singapore. Today's guest is Nilanjana Sengupta, an author and historian with a deep interest in gender, migration, and social history. For Nilanjana, storytelling was a legacy written before she was born. It's how she connects with her roots, her late father, and how she makes sense of every place she's lived. In this conversation, we explore how the stories we tell shape who we become. Let's dive into Nilanjana's story. Nilanjana and I meet in a coffee shop in the East. It's a warm day, and I'm a little tired and sore from a challenging yoga class. I need caffeine. We buy tea, and in a few minutes, the caffeine and Nilanjana's enthusiastic energy have revived me. As Nilanjana tells me about her day, she's meticulously articulate, thoughtful, except when she laughs. Her laugh is free, a powerful giggle that seems to belong to a younger, more unguarded version of herself, as if some essential part of her childhood refuses to be left behind. And in these moments, it's hard to believe that Nilanjana is the author of 5 books, all rooted in deep historical research with a strong feminist perspective. This is a conversation that unfolds like the pages of a novel, sweeping through thoughts on Bengal's literary traditions, the weight of parental legacy, the unseen labor of women, and the deep, shifting experience of being an expat in a country that you love and yet is never truly home. I begin our conversation where curiosity leads me, asking about the meaning of her name.
It means blue eyes for some reason, which I don't have. I think aspirational on my father's part. But I don't know. But it also means dark clouds, which is really nice. And it's also a part of a Tagore song, which is even nicer. And he actually talks about, lowering skies and cloudy monsoons. The best part of Bengal.
All Indians, not just Bengalis, are defined by monsoon nostalgia. There's something about the heaviness in the air, the first defiant drop of rain, the dusty scent of dry earth awakening, that unlocks a flood of memories in every Indian heart. These stories spill from Nilanjana as well, and listening to her, it feels like the past isn't stored away in some distant archive, but for her lives just beneath the surface of her present life, breathing and alive.
It's so beautiful. It's very dramatic. Even in our house in Calcutta, it used to be so nice during the monsoons because, the maids would rush up. There used to be instant drama and to get the clothes from the terrace, and then they would hang it out in the drawing room. And so I would play these games, with the saris, my mom's saris, and just being kind of, embraced by her fragrance and by the smell of starch. It just kind of set your senses soaring. Calcutta is very romantic during the monsoons, I must say.
Nilanjana's connection to Calcutta isn't just nostalgia. It's here that her destiny was written, its pages marked by legacy and loss. When I asked her to explain this connection, what unfolded wasn't just fond childhood memories, but a narrative shaped by absence.
We were true blue bongs, in the sense very unapologetically intellectual, And my dad was a writer and an editor and an artist. So, though he passed away very young, Rani, I was just 6 months old when he passed away. I don't have any living memories of him as such, but the point is that I'm so much like him. The moment I think my relatives saw me, they were like, oh, she looks so much like a father. And then as I was growing older, I became more and more like him. So, this, whatever writing skill, what I'm supposedly, I have, it's absolutely a legacy from him.
It's a fascinating paradox how someone can be shaped by the absence of a person that they never truly knew, who they never really met. But it was in the spaces that he left behind that Nilanjana discovered her father and also discovered herself.
He had built the house, Rani, for us to live in. So he had moved away from the joint family home and he had built this house. And I remember like maybe when I was 5 or 6, and my mom would be sleeping in the afternoon. Bengalis have this habit of siesta. And I would go to his study, and there are these shelves and shelves of books. And one of the books I remember from that time is a book of paintings by Van Gogh. And you just take it out and you just lose yourself. You remember the very iconic paintings, the two farmhands sleeping by the field, or the chair in his room. So I would kind of trace each stroke and the colors. So I discovered my father through his books and also through the paintings. Our house used to be chock-a-block with paintings. And these were all the Bengali classics, Abanindranath Tagore and others. We had more paintings in our house than we had windows. So, so it was absolutely growing up within the aesthetic that he had decided to leave behind for us. And maybe during the Durga Pujas or just before the Durga Pujas, my mom would do her spring cleaning. And out would come huge trunk full of his clothes, Japanese kimonos, the finest of silks. And I remember just touching the embroidery, touching the feel of the silk. And it's almost like I could feel my father there. So he was definitely very much present within us, outside us, in our home, and constantly being talked about. The kind of books I read, the kind of music I listened to, a great deal of it was kind of pre-decided, I think, by my father. So definitely an inspiration, and definitely the way I'm heading is what he laid out for me. That's what I feel.
As I edit this, I pause to take in the beauty of this story. A father's legacy which isn't passed down through direct experience, but through echoes. His presence lingering in the art on the walls, the house that whispers his name, the bookshelves that hold his thoughts. His voice should have filled these rooms. Now music and poetry take its place. A father never present, yet never really absent. But a legacy doesn't preserve itself. Someone kept those echoes from fading, kept his presence alive in the absence. And as Nilanjana speaks, it becomes clear it was her mother who carried this memory forward, who refused to let time erase him.
Oh my God, she tried so hard to keep him alive. Even his writing desk, Rani, it was never changed or moved out. It was one of those roll top desks with the pigeonhole drawers, and each drawer you open and it's like a discovery. There's a treasure trove in each one of them. He used to be an artist, so a lot of crayon colors, lot of acrylic. The tubes would be dry by then, but even then my mother never threw them away. And as far as my mother goes, I think she just encircled us with love and security. I had written in a poem after she passed away that she tied my feet to the picture of a god. And that's absolutely true, that's what she did. I think all of us are defined by our mothers. But because she was a single parent, the influence was very strong.
These stories of strong, determined single mothers have become a recurring theme in my podcast. Women whom the world never imagined could forge ahead without a husband by their side. And yet they did. And they also pushed their daughters forward, onward into the light.
She was brought up in a very traditional way as well. But at the same time, how progressive she was. I think that was what was so special about her. For example, when I wanted to marry, and I wanted to marry out of my caste, and he is also from Bangladesh. So there's a whole lot of clash happening there. But never for once did she make me feel that, you're carrying the burden of the honor of the family. So you need to be careful about taking this decision. And the way she had kind of been pushed into a marriage when she was very young. And I think she really wanted a very different life for us. She went against everybody in the family. So she kind of cleared the way for me. That's how deep rooted and kind of absolutely unconditional her love was.
At this point, I asked Nilanjana what Bengali culture truly means for a woman. She starts with her own story, what Bengali culture meant in her home. shaped by her mother's love and her father's lingering presence. But then she steps back and looks at the bigger picture, the version lived by most women in Bengal and in India, one that isn't about books and ideas, but about tradition, duty, and expectation.
What it translated to in my case was a lot of Bengali literature. That's something that my mother really insisted on. Yeah. And frankly speaking, my grounding in Bengali literature still inspires me. And you know the kind of literature we have. It's not only Tagore or, Banking Chandra or Sharachandra. There are two authors specifically. There is Bibhuti Bhushan Mukhopadhyay and Bibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay. Now, Vibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay is the person whose novel Satyajit Ray based his Oppu trilogy on. So, very sensory writing. But having said that, that was my family, immediate family. The extended family is very traditional. You marry a Bengali man of our caste. You follow the cultural rituals as well. Wear a sari or cover your head maybe after marriage, wear sindoor, all those little things, which are not bad in their own way, but those are things that I carry in my heart, but I don't necessarily practice.
We meander a little here to a topic that often crosses my mind. It sometimes feels like men only impose tradition, and women, on the other hand, must embody tradition. Why is it that women bear the burden of keeping tradition alive? I asked Nilanjana for her thoughts on this.
We have traditional food, which is extremely time consuming and it takes a lot of effort to put out that whole show for you. But then, how much of it becomes the responsibility of the lady of the house? So, a lot of the culture, even the honor that we spoke about a few minutes back, it's all on the women of the house, that you wear the right clothes, you marry the right man, you come back at the right time. All of this is dictated out only for women. Men kind of get it quite easy, right? Patriarchal practices, I really think that we need to take a relook. At the same time, of course, there is a fear of losing out on so much of the legacy. And that's kind of sad because a lot of it is also very beautiful. It pulls the community together. There's a lot of warmth out there and it gives us our roots. But at the same time, I think it should be equally divided, at least between the genders. If we want to kind of, carry on with certain practices, it should be done equally by him and by me. Then it's at least fair.
I really like this answer. Tradition isn't a burden if it's shared equally. It's a nice thought. But as I'm editing this, I have to acknowledge that we're still a long way from achieving that. This does, however, give me the perfect segue because there is a Bengali tradition that seems to have found this balance, one that puts women right at the center of the celebration, Durga Puja.
It's beautiful, yeah. And the best part of it is female empowering, so gender blind. It is also class and caste blind.
As a South Indian, I don't know that much about Durga Puja, and I had to do some online research to add details. And I thought I'd share those with you now in case you're like me and have never celebrated this festival. This is what I discovered. Durga Puja is a celebration of Shakti, the divine feminine energy that creates, sustains, and destroys. It honors goddess Durga, who, according to Hindu mythology, was created by the combined powers of all the gods to defeat a demon, a battle she fought for 10 days before striking the final blow. A woman with power, a demon slayer, it's easy to see why this festival has become such an important festival for modern women. It honors the warrior and the nurturer. And in today's India, it seems as though the goddess Durga has become a metaphor for modern womanhood. The constant balancing act of home and work, tradition and independence, expectation and desire. It's the imagery of Durga Puja that stays in my mind. Women dressed in white and red saris, their faces streaked with red powder, dancing, joy unrestrained, beauty in motion. That red powder, or sindoor, is traditionally a marker of marriage, and on this day, in some places, It's freed from these confines, and all women, unmarried women, widows, sex workers, transgender women, all women can wear sindoor on this day. I asked Nilanjana, how did her family celebrate Durga Puja?
We had Durga Puja in our house. This is in Chandonnagor, which is a French colony, just very close to Calcutta. So we have a house there and it's still celebrated and the family gets together. So Durga Puja for me stands for the puja that we had in our house. The aunts and the daughters-in-law, they kind of will sit together, cut the vegetables, sit in a circle. Lot of laughter, lot of gossip, and lot of dressing up, which is something that you really enjoy. You wear your best saris, best jewelry, and then the dhaki wala will come, the person who plays the drums, and all the children are dancing to it. So, and then there is a courtyard in the middle, in front of the Thakur Dalan, where basically the goddess is kept. But then when you are in Calcutta, living in the city, there are a lot of these public Durga Pujas which happen. We have these beautiful pandals and they are like a piece of art, in fact. And the best part is that anybody can join in. It's open to the people. So it's class blind, it is racially blind as well. And in today's Calcutta, for example, Durga Puja is as much of a celebration for the Marwaris or for the Chinese as much as it is for us Bengalis. So that's the beauty of this puja. And when we kind of try to restrict it within a certain class of people, it kind of loses its beauty and significance.
Brought up in a staunch Christian family, I was always drawn to Hindu festivals. Compared to the quiet, measured rituals I knew, they just felt thunderous, kaleidoscopic, gloriously alive. This was a world where gods walk among us, where tradition isn't a whisper but a roar. I love how these festivals keep the ancient vibrantly alive in the modern world, a reminder that we are bound to something greater than ourselves, something that's timeless. Nilanjana speaks to this too, the way tradition carries not just history, but deep emotion as well.
That day, in fact, I was telling somebody, she was talking about mother tongue. And sometimes, Rani, I love listening to Tagore songs. I think all Bengalis do. But sometimes I very intentionally don't, because if I do, there are so many layers of emotions which will open up in me that I find it very difficult to focus on my work and my everyday life at that point. So sometimes I'll just keep it away, but because it just makes me feel a bit too much, it kind of draws me in so completely. And that's what exactly Calcutta life is all about. It just draws you in. You just don't know where to draw a line between public and private. In Singapore, it is much calmer. You know that this is your little bubble. If you decide to step out of it, yes, you're part of a larger life. And people are quite welcoming as well. They are willing to accept you. But then, if you want to stay back, you are there. But in Kolkata, there are no boundaries. You're just open to it all the time.
I know well the blurred boundaries that Nilanjana speaks of, the smudging of public and private life, the emotional sensory overload that stuns you in a bustling Indian city like Calcutta. There's something about it that forces you to be open to people, to explore new experiences. And maybe it's this spirit of discovery that Nilanjana carries to her storytelling, because what she's really done in her books is to explore. The first book, A Gentleman's Word, is a deep dive into the lasting impact of Subhash Chandra Bose's Indian National Army. It explores his legacy and what he left behind. Her next, The Female Voice of Myanmar, offers a powerful examination of the voices of Burmese women, including Aung San Suu Kyi. Singapore, My Country is the biography of M.B. Balasubramaniam, and The Votive Pen is a look at the work of Edwin Thumboo. But it's her very latest book, Chickpeas to Cook and Other Stories, that I'm really interested in discussing with her. First, I asked Nilanjana when the writer in her was born.
Hmm. Actually, that happened not in Kolkata, which is very surprising because Kolkata it breeds creativity, But the thing is, it happened in Singapore for me because here when I came, and just before that, there was a huge personal tragedy which really rocked my family. I lost my brother-in-law and very dear to all of us, and my mother was completely broken. And that's when, Rani, for the first time in my entire life, I was like, I need to do something serious now. And I need to do something that will make my mother happy. I want to see her smiling again. I was, what, late 30s? You know, quite a lot of my life had gone past. And that's when I was researching an article on the Indian National Army. And I was doing an article for Hindustan Times. And I happened to come and meet a lot of people here who were equally or even more interested in the INA. And that's when my first book happened.
The here Nilanjana refers to as Singapore, and she's speaking about her first book, about the legacy of Subhash Chandra Bose.
Growing up in Calcutta, he was very much a part of my childhood, and we had very close connections with the Bose family as well. In fact, his nephew used to be my pediatrician, Shishir Kumar Bose, one of the most handsome doctors. And I had asthma when I was a child, and my mom would take me to him, and I would listen to my mother and him, talking about their mutual families. And my father used to be a close friend of the doctor. Dr. Bose. So, the connections went back very far. And then when I came here and when I realized that the stories are actually going to be about these women and the youngsters who had joined the Balika Sena. And the best part is, as I kind of, explored the subject and went deeper, I realized that most of the Indian population here, the older families, they had some connection or the other with the INA.
Okay, a quick recap is definitely needed. If not for you, then for me. Subhash Chandra Bose was an Indian nationalist leader who sought to overthrow British rule through armed resistance. So, an approach in direct contrast to Gandhi's non-violent approach. He formed the Indian National Army, the INA, with Japanese support in 1942. The Indian National Army was based in Singapore, primarily because Singapore was under Japanese occupation at that time. The Balika Sena was set up to train young girls, often teenagers, in nationalist ideology and discipline, preparing them for a role in the independence movement. But it was the Rani of Jhansi Regiment, which Nilanjana will speak about next, that became the all-women combat unit of the INA.
I had gone to Malaysia to interview Janki Nahapan, and she was one of the, top rung leaders of Rani of Jhansi Regiment. And she had Subhash Chandra Bose's picture on her mantelpiece along with her family members. And every time she would talk about him, she would get emotional because that's the kind of closeness and connection that she felt with him.
The INA was defeated in 1945 and Bose himself died, or some say disappeared, after his plane crashed. This mystery lives on, as does his legacy. And it's this legacy that Nilanjana is interested in.
Because my book was not about Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose in particular. It was about the legacy that he left behind. And there were so many inspiring lives. I had the chance to, interact with them, to kind of interview them, to even live with some of them. That is the point where I actually started growing. That's when I decided that, yes, this is it. And of course, my mother was absolutely elated. The first time my picture was published by a newspaper in Singapore, I've never seen her more happy. And I knew that this is the path I need to take because this is so fulfilling for me and for my mother. So I think it was a decision more for my mother than for myself.
I asked Nilanjana about her first impressions of Singapore. It wasn't an unfamiliar country to her. She had been researching its history long before she arrived.
I think we came 15 years back and we were living somewhere near Orchard. And I remember it was early morning, August. and it had rained in the morning. And we came out, me, my husband, and my daughter. Daughter was a tiny tot at that time. And we came out looking for breakfast. And it was so beautiful. I remember in particular the Goodwood Park Hotel, which is so beautiful. And then there was a whole row of these black and white bungalows. And I was absolutely kind of taken by the beauty of Singapore. But then the best part is that there was an old Chanky. There still is an old Chanky right out there. We found this little old auntie, and she was speaking in Singlish, and we had the local food. And that's such a beautiful fusion in Singapore that everything is not elitist. There is also a real throb of life. And that auntie and all those taxi drivers who drove me in the first part of my stay here, I think they made me fall in love with this country.
But what truly held her attention was Singapore's past. It was the history that pulled at her, the layers beneath the modern city, the stories tucked away in its streets, the echoes of migration, struggle, and resilience that still lingered, if you knew where to look.
I was living in Balmoral Road, and just across the street is Gilstead Road and Chancery Lane, where Netaji's headquarters used to be. So it was amazing because you're sitting on history. And I had grown up in Kolkata, I had gone to the same college, Presidency College, where Netaji studied. So can you imagine? I find that Chancery Lane was the Indian Independence League's headquarters, and Gilstead Road was the camp of the INA, where the youngsters used to train and the administrative office used to be. So I'm absolutely sitting on this, ticking bomb of history. That was the first gesture of friendship from Singapore, and we became good friends.
This discovery excites me as much as it does Nilanjana. I live in the same area and often walk my dog along these streets.
Oh, that's where you stay. You didn't know, I bet, that that's where all of this was. Yeah, yeah. And the thing is, SMU, that's where the Rani of Jhansi camp used to be. That's where the girls used to exercise. That's where they first time wore their military uniform and they went out for their march. And they were so embarrassed because people were standing all around and kind of jeering at them. And can you imagine Tamil girls coming all the way from Malaysia, rubber plantations? They have been tappers over there and they are in military uniform now and marching across the street in public view. That's a part of history that Singapore holds kind of very close to its heart, I think. And I have really enjoyed unearthing those stories. What was the life like in those camps? How they felt so embarrassed because the first tailor, they would refuse to give their measurements to a male tailor. So he had to organize a female tailor for them. So, and then they would refuse to come out of the barracks because they would just march around within the compound, but not outside. And then you see them blossom afterwards and find their whole purpose in life.
These stories bubble out of Nilanjana like an overflowing spring, effortless, full of life, brimming with details that might otherwise be forgotten. I appreciate this about her. As a history enthusiast myself, I find these fragments of Singapore's past so captivating. I'm curious, how does she choose her projects? What draws her to a particular story, a particular voice, amidst the vast ocean of untold histories?
I have to be emotionally attached. And once I'm emotionally attached and drawn by the story, that's when I get into rigorous research. And that kind of pushes me. If there is none of that emotional pull, I don't think I would do it. For example, there was this person who had called me up, one of the biggest, or I think the biggest hedge fund owner in Singapore. And he wanted me to do a biography on him. And he was willing to pay a lot of money. But there's no way I can do a story. Firstly, I don't understand anything at all about finance. I'm a typical Bengali that way. I don't even know the difference between depreciation and debentures or whatever. My mind goes into a brain freeze, when these kind of topics come up. But then after that, Edwin Thambu, the first interview, he told me, Nilanjana, be very clear, there's no money in this. You're not going to earn big bucks. And I think that's what triggered me into writing that book, because that's who I am. If I'm not emotionally drawn into something, I'll just not do it. There's nobody, no force on earth which can make me do it, least of all money. It absolutely engrosses your whole life. So if you're committing to it, it has to come with your heart and your entirety of your being, you know. My first book was published in 2012, so 12 years exactly. It has crafted me as the person I am today. So I cannot talk about my books and the rest of my life, or my work and the rest of my life. My work is me, and that's what it's kind of interactive. Whatever I experience in life, that goes back into my work, and whatever I find out and research in my work kind of flows back into my life.
When I read Chickpeas to Cook, I sensed this same attachment that she speaks of, a kind of total immersion in her characters. I asked her about the origins of this book.
After doing my book on Edwin Thambu, he is a person who personifies the multiculturalism of Singapore. He's of mixed parentage himself, and that's what he stands for, the different cultures, the hyphenated identities that we talk about. So there's no way that you can interact with him without coming away with the nucleus of an idea that you need to kind of explore this whole facet of Singapore a bit more to understand what the identity really means here. And so that was my first trigger. And then, triggered by that, I actually joined the IRO.
The IRO is the Interreligious Organization of Singapore, a multi-faith organization founded in 1949 to promote religious harmony and interfaith dialogue in Singapore.
I have had a lot of people laugh about IRO, that, you know, it's one of those, another acronym in Singapore, another organization that they have pulled out of their hat. But you really do realize the kind of very earnest efforts they put into drawing the different communities together, or kind of building up that sincere sense of respect for other religions. That's something that really moved me. There is a lot of earnest effort happening over there. I don't know how effective it is, but it is definitely earnest. And that was my second point, which kind of moved me and stirred my emotions. And then when we are talking about the micro communities, I was also intrigued by the CMIO model that we have here. And when we are talking about the O part of it, that very small percentage, it obviously triggered my interest that how do these women live? And I was already very keen to work on women. So, what is happening under those layers? When you see these women very smartly dressed, leaving for office, you go to the CBD, you see so many of them. So, when they go back home, how is home life for them, or what is family life for them? What are the difficulties? So, to be honest, I started out by wanting to write a book which would celebrate the multiculturalism of Singapore. But frankly, I ended up by writing about the difficulties and challenges of these women's lives.
At this point, let me give you a taste of Chickpeas to Cook. It has a unique format. Each chapter begins with a fact-based exploration of the community, traditions, religion, origin stories. But then in a brilliant narrative shift for the women's individual stories, Nilanjana uses fiction, bringing these women's stories to life in a way that pure non-fiction might not have allowed. Through this approach, Chickpeas to Cook doesn't just document, it immerses. Faces emerge from the pages, their lives unfolding with a depth and intimacy that lingers long after you've turned the last page. For example, she writes, Sakina walked in, and as always, I was struck by the strange and shuddering vitality she embodied, as if some power had breathed a life into her that was different from my own. Her hair fell in thick, unruly cascades. Her long silk kaftan came to a demure, swishing halt at her feet. Later she'll write of Sakina. Sakina had started wearing the ridda. The light of the setting sun is on her forehead. I no longer see any duality there. Her gentleness and vigor, her repose and restlessness have come together in a single pointed, calm, quivering determination to surrender. It's this duality that Nilanjana explores.
Thing is, the numbers, if you look at the numbers, actually the numbers are really small. You know, for example, the Parsi community in the 1970s, just 40 of them. Even today, just a very modest 350. And or for example, the Bori Muslims, just 900 families, Chettiyas 1,000. So the numbers are really small, but at the same time I think the layers are many and very intense. It's like those flaky pastries with sugar at every layer. So you're kind of licking off the sugar. That's what I was doing. I would go to each family, not even each family, to each individual, and the stories would differ, the experiences would differ. So there is an explosion waiting to happen over there in terms of stories. There is so much to unravel. And once I got into it, I think I was completely sucked in. And I didn't know, it wasn't a conscious decision that I would do the Bori Muslims first and the Jews second. It just kind of led me from one community to another. So it was a very natural, organic evolution for me as the stories progress. One thing I want to say, that it is quite surprising. It really stirred me, in fact, that right from the first story on the Bori Muslims to the last story, which was on the Parsis, each woman that I have focused on, they have gone through an unhappy life, unhappy marriage. And I would think, even today, if you ask me, I would feel that that has a great deal to do with the size of the community. Because there is such intense fear. One is of survival. They don't know if the next generation will kind of carry on with the traditions. There is also fear of stigma because the communities, like I said, the numbers are so small. Everybody knows each other. One visit to the Tank Road temple, and your life is an open book for everybody. So there is so much of fear of stigma. There is at the same time the need of acceptance. Women do a lot of things because they need to be accepted by their community. So the emotions that run through that, through those communities, are very strong. And I feel that that is one thing that perhaps also contributes to the tensions at home. Back in India, it is so much easier for the smaller communities to survive because in India, that boundary line is not so firmly etched as in Singapore. The moment you're stepping out of your community in Singapore, you are in the midst of one of the fastest moving, most modern cities. I think the stresses and strains lead to an equation of a unhappy marriage, unhappy life, because that's what I found. I'm not claiming that everybody 100% everybody is, but it just happened that I was led from one woman to another who had gone through physically challenging marriages, mentally challenging marriages for sure, and has gone through some kind of difficulty with their children, with their the in-laws, all of that. So for me as a writer, of course, it was extremely interesting. Who wouldn't like to unravel those stories? But going back to your question, that who really stood out for me, I don't think any of these women in particular, they were all extremely inspiring. And I think what I really kind of appreciate about them is their strength. You know, despite the difficulties that they have gone through, torturous marriages, torturous fathers' lives in general, but yet they have not turned bitter. They want their children to learn the good things about community. They want to carry on with the traditions in the best way they can. When they invite me to their home, they will make food from their culture to explain to me the finer nuances of their culture. So I think that lack of bitterness, that strength that I saw in them to hold their families together, to kind of hold themselves in a sense of with dignity, I think that really stood out for me.
I pause here. What kind of world do we live in where the absence of bitterness becomes something to admire? Sure, it's a sign of strength, resilience, and grace, the ability to rise above. But perhaps, as I'm sure Nilanjana would agree, the real question is, why is such strength needed in the first place? I want to discuss food because I know food is also a burden, often borne solely by women. Yet it's more than just labor, right? It holds memory, belonging, and tradition. Food has a language of its own.
It brings into our mind a lot of memories, the sense of comfort of our mother's kitchen, but at the same time, how it can also be a space for conflict. And that's what I wanted to highlight, that we were talking about Sakina's story. There is an incident, her father comes back quite late in the night, and he's come back with a whole group of friends, and he tells her to cook something for them. And she says, "No, I can't do it." Though she says it in a very docile way. But then he just picks up the spoon which is on the hot oven and slashes it across her face.
Here's the excerpt from the book. And then in a flash, he picked up the chamcha, still hot from the flaming griddle, and slashed it across Amma's face. And in her head, Sakina knew no was not a word to use in front of Abba.
So there you find food has become a space for conflict. Again, the very disturbing incident that happens, that Sakina is now in college and it's been raining the entire day. So she gets delayed, and she absolutely sprints up the stairs, and but her father will not open the door because she's late. And he makes her stand in the rain for a couple of hours, completely drenched, and then finally opens the door, tells her to sit down in her wet clothes at the table to eat. And she picks up the first mouthful of food, and he hits her hard across her face and hits her again and again till she falls face downward into the food.
Sakina says in the book, that day I thought to myself, what kind of love is this? Amma was crying because she loved me so much. Abba was hitting me because he wanted me to be a good girl. And yet, why didn't their love make me happy?
So basically, what we are talking about is the kind of control that these male figures wanted to keep, or even perhaps want to keep today. That's only happening because women have become so much more independent, and there is no way that we can control them. Yet that controlling instinct that a man has doesn't disappear.
I myself struggled with my relationship to cooking. I like it. I like the way a home cooked meal carries messages of love. But cooking isn't a feminist act. It was what the patriarchy expected, right? The role that was assigned to me. So I ask, when I broke away from so many traditions, how can I surrender to this one? Can I really reclaim it as my own, as something I love, that very thing that once confined and controlled us?
And I think that's where the male role also needs to change. I mean, one of the first questions when my book was launched, the day it was launched, a girl got up and said that if we have so much of chickpeas to cook, when do we do other things? Domestic duties, cultural duties, religious duties, all of it needs to be divided.
This topic, food and women, it's something I really need to explore in a deeper way. There's so much to unpack here. But for now, I asked Nilanjana about her process. How does she find the balance between being respectful and pushing to find something that a reader will find engaging?
Still engaging and also saying the truth, speaking the truth. I think that was also very important to me, because I think the biggest struggle at while writing Chickpeas to Cook was with myself, because you would hear certain stories and you would have some kind of a inbred bias for or against what you were hearing. So it was a constant struggle in me to keep my focus on the truth rather than on my biases. And also, of course, gaining the trust of these women. It was not easy. Mm, and then, of course, when you know that you are going to sit today morning and write about Islam, you're going to sit the next day morning and write about Judaism, it's not easy. It would give me sleepless nights. Then, how to write about the religion, which kind of gives the essence of the religion and is not derogatory in any way at all. What really helped me there, Rani, is uh, the point that I was writing it in some ways for my daughter, because she had grown up in a very different world than what we knew. She had grown up in the post 9/11 world, where religion is looked at with so much of skepticism, with so much of distrust. Religion today has come to stand for fundamentalism, to be equated with terrorism, which is really sad. So I wanted to change that. I wanted to show her how beautiful, how peaceful, how anchoring religion can be. And that's what I wrote.
I'm quite curious about Nilanjana's choice to tell the stories of these women, because her stories so far have been about famous people: Edwin Tambu, Aung San Suu Kyi, Subhash Chandra Bose, and more.
These are huge, mammoth figures. And after that, I really wanted to paint miniatures. I wanted to write about that woman in the street who's just like me, who has faced and confronted all the challenges of everyday life. So that was my starting point. But then when I went and met these women, of course, it was a different story because they are even huge than any other celebrity that I have known. They are so brave and so courageous.
Chickpeas to Cook is a beautiful little book, and I encourage all of you to read it. It really offers a rare glimpse into Singapore's smaller, often overlooked communities, and it brings their stories to life with real depth and tenderness. As our conversation shifts, I asked Nilanjana about her own identity. What does it mean to be an Indian in Singapore, but not a Singaporean Indian, an expat? How has that shaped her perspective? How does it define her sense of belonging?
No, there was kind of situations of microaggression. There are so many times when I'm traveling by public transport in a bus and nobody will come and sit next to me. They would prefer to sit next to a Singaporean, let's say. Or I walk into a shop and the lady is talking to other people in Mandarin and obviously does not include me. So those kind of microaggressions are, I'm not saying they don't happen, but I think the larger thing that happened was after Chickpeas to Cook was published, it faced a certain amount of criticism. I mean, why not? Of course, I would welcome that. But then what I felt was that a lot of it came from the stereotypical image that Singaporeans have about expat wives, especially if you're a banker's wife and they know it, they automatically tend to assume that we are these hapless, brainless wannabes, oodles of time on our hand, or who just want to do something for the sake of doing it without really researching or understanding the topic. It's taken the last couple of years and many, many platforms where I've spoken about the book. I think now it is sinking in that what I'm trying to say holds some truth.
I have faced this prejudice as well, labeled expat wife, trailing wife. These labels can seem harmless, but they stick like glue, bringing with them images of a lunching, brunching, yoga mat type lifestyle. The problem with labels is that they're often not true, and they strip women of their individuality and ambition, reducing them to a stereotype. They leave you at a social occasion being the only one who's not asked, "How was your day? What do you do? Where do you work?" As if you're not part of the world of work and purpose, just an accessory to someone else's story.
I'm going to write about that more extensively in my current book. I think that is something that we need to look at. I feel that is also partly our own fault. There are a lot of expat wives who just go to the clubs and, go back to their own country to do their shopping and come back and stay here in their little bubbles. So it is partly our fault as well. If, as a new expat, you don't go out and you just tend to stick to your own community, and then you cannot complain about the fact that I don't know anything about the country. I mean, if I come and stay in Orchard and my son or daughter goes to an international school and then goes to a foreign university, then I have just clung on to the very external view of Singapore that that is publicized. But then if you go into the HDB heartland or you volunteer with the real people of Singapore, that's where you get to know what the country is all about. That's where you actually discover the throb of life. And I think as expats, we have that duty. But we need to kind of delve deeper, perhaps. At the same time, if the people also kind of look at us as not just wannabes who want to come here and make some quick bucks and go back, then perhaps it would be nicer. So, yes, in my new book, I do want to talk about it. If I were to put it in another way, the sense of otherness. What goes into the manufacturing of the other, the experiencing of the otherness, what goes into the understanding of the other. But at the same time, you realize that that sense of self comes when you are confronting these other cultures. As long as you are in that cocoon and in that bubble of being the empress of whatever you see around you, you don't really know who you are inside. It's only when it is challenged, your sense of self is challenged, that's when you'd really discover, you really start thinking that, who am I?
I appreciate Nilanjana's open and honest answer. She doesn't just talk about belonging, she dissects it, laying out how both expats and locals contribute to this feeling of otherness. She acknowledges the expat bubble, which exists, we all know, but also makes it clear that breaking out of it is entirely possible if the intent is there. I really respond to her suggestion that expats have a responsibility to step beyond this curated existence, to engage with the country they now call home. What I find even more compelling is her observation that identity is shaped through difference. In your own country, you never really have to define yourself. When you exist in a space where your sense of self is constantly questioned, commented on, challenged, and reframed, then you're forced to begin the process of truly understanding who you are. It's a powerful reframing of what many see as a struggle to integrate. Instead of a problem, she presents an opportunity for a deeply personal journey of self-discovery.
Rani, the first interview I did with Edwin Thambu, he had told me that I wrote myself into the center of Singapore. As you think about it, you do realize that that's what each one of us need to do. We need to kind of, propel ourselves into the center and heart of Singapore if we are going to be true to our creative art.
I've loved this meandering journey with Nilanjana, the way we've wandered through history, identity, belonging, and tradition. But before we end, I want to ground it with something tangible, some real advice for young writers who are trying to find their way.
Don't hesitate to completely reinvent your whole book. Like I have done, I think, with each one of my books. As you travel and as you realize that the stories are changing, you need to change with that. Don't be too lazy or to kind of hold back on the research, on starting all over again. And secondly, I think the biggest advice is to kill that voice, the bias, the stereotypes that you have formulated within you, that you have been socialized into. You have to kill all of that, eradicate all of that. You have to start with a clean slate. For example, when I was doing the story on the Bori Muslims, the whole idea of donning a rida, a burqa, it fills you up with the idea of restriction, the idea of patriarchy, of being oppressed. But then, and I rewrote that story, Rani, I think at least 6 times, because I was just not willing to let go of that in my mind. It was so deeply rooted. The sixth version, which is now the printed version, it shows her actually adopting the Rida from a position of strength. She is doing it because she has crossed so many challenging paths, and it is her religious and spiritual anchor that has kind of held her together. It's not being imposed on her in any way. She feels that sense of pride in her culture, in who she is as a person at that moment. You have to be very keen to work through the layers to find what the bedrock is, what the truth is. I think as an author, that's your biggest job.
As I reflect on Nilanjana's words, I think again about how stories change and shape us. She's shown me the power of the written word, not just to tell stories and record history, but to root us in the place that we live. It's a reminder that through our work, through our art, whether it's writing, painting, filmmaking, or even volunteering, we can find connection and belonging anywhere. This is something that's going to stay with me. I'm so grateful to Nilanjana for sharing her story and for you for listening to this story. I hope it leaves you with many things to reflect on and to contemplate until we meet again with another inspiring conversation right here on The Brown Box.